Hello, BookTube. It's time for Chapter 4 of William Harris Arnold's Ventures in Book Collecting. Chapter is entitled Luck of a Book Collector, A Few of My Biggest Finds. When one has a certain degree of success in any line of endeavor, his achievement is variously commented on. Some admire his skill or abilities, others envy him his good luck. Neither is quite right. In the game of golf, for instance, a trio sometimes happens to hole out from a long distance. That is luck, pure and simple. The skillful player, on the other hand, always expects that the approach shot will land somewhere near the hole, and he is not entirely surprised when the ball occasionally drops in. When a man says, "Luck came my way," he doesn't mean exactly that. He means that he really knows where good opportunities are likely to be found, and he takes his stand right there and waits patiently, as the intelligent hunter for his game. I am not quite so modest as that. I know that luck enters as largely into the pursuit of rare books and manuscripts as it does in most other pursuits, but I cannot help admitting that I, for one, take a naive pleasure in plumbing myself somewhat because I have been unusually fortunate, or call it what you will, in entering and bagging some rather big finds. On Friday the 13th of March in the year of 1903, when I was having a chat with a veteran dealer in autographs, Walter Roman Benjamin, he alluded to some highly important Tennyson manuscripts which were offered for sale by Nijhoff. Who is Nijhoff? I said. Nijhoff in New York is the branch of Martinus Nijhoff, a firm of booksellers in The Hague. Mr. Benjamin described the manuscript in detail. I recognized them at once to be those that had been recently advertised by Henry Southern and Company of London as stolen from them. Half an hour later, I was in Scribner's, where I mentioned the matter to Henry Levitt Smith, who then was the efficient manager of that distinguished bookshop. Mr. Smith declared he would go immediately to Nijhoff's, whose place of business was a little way down the avenue. I suggested that it might be better for me to go. This I did, and I was soon told the little there was to tell. Nijhoff never had the Tennyson manuscript, but prior to the theft by arrangement with Southern, they had undertaken to offer them in this country. As I turned to go, the courteous salesman said, "Would you like to see the earliest existing letter written in what is now New York?" To myself, I said, "This is too big a fish for my little nook." To the other man, "I should like to have a look at it." I was conducted to an inner room and introduced to the business manager, Bol van Hensbroek, who had come from Holland for a brief visit. He had brought back to New York a letter written from the island of the Manhates on 8th of August 1628, only 2 years after the purchase of the island from the Indians. The recent circumstances were these: the letter, carefully preserved by the descendants of the recipient for 275 years, had been sent with other documents to R.W.P. de Vries in Amsterdam to be sold at auction. Its great historical importance and high interest were recognized by the firm, and it was catalogued accordingly. Frederick Mueller and Company bought the letter, and the morning after sold it to the firm of Martin Nijhoff, who only one collector in New York has seen it, and had made an offer a little under the price at which it was held. Mr. Van Hensbroek had arranged with a reporter of New York Herald to give the letter a write-up, and a hasty translation had been made, which also would be put in the newspaper. The price was only a small fraction of the quick valuation I had made. I succumbed to the allure to the extent that I asked for an option over the weekend. I told Mr. Van Hensbroek that I should be much more likely to buy the letter if the plans for the newspaper publication could be cancelled. He immediately withdrew them by the phone. The next day I called on Wilberforce Eames at the Lenox Library. Mr. Eames' opinion would be conclusive, for there was no higher authority in the field of Americana. He had heard of the letter, but had not seen it. He was keenly interested. Another letter by the same writer, of 3 days later date, had long been regarded as one of the treasures of the library. My request for an estimate of the commercial value of the newly discovered letter met with prompt response. Mr. Eames named the sum just 5 times the price. The hasty translation had been made by Dingham Versteeg, Dutch by birth, American by adoption, curator for the Holland Society of New York. I immediately gauged Mr. Versteeg to make a careful translation. The writer of the letter was Jonas Michaelis, the first minister of the Dutch Reformed Church in this country. Dominie Michaelis arrived on the island of the Manhits on the 7th of April 1628, 7th of April 1628, accompanied by his wife and 3 children. The letter briefly describes the voyage from Holland, which lasted 73 days. It was a tempestuous passage, rendered additionally uncomfortable by the conduct of the arbitrary skipper and a very wicked and ungodly cook. The greater part of the letter, which covers 3 very closely written pages of the folio sheet, describes the conditions of living, the relations of the colonists with the Indians, and the prospect of little settlement. The 4th page bears the superscription, which translated reads, "Honorable, well-learned, very wise, prudent, valiant, and very discreet Sir D. Johannes Forrest, Secretary of the Honorable Lords of the Executive Council of the State of North Holland and West Friesland, residing at Hoorn. My friend whom God preserves." The other letter of Dominie Michaelis belonging to the Lenox Library was written to Adrian Smoothius, a brother minister residing in Amsterdam. A translation of this had been more than once printed. It seemed not only worthwhile to print the translation of the earlier letter, but to unite that with the historical sketch. This project met with Mr. Versteeg's hearty commendation. His attempts fitted him for the task. Steeped in knowledge of Dutch history of the 16th and 17th centuries, proud of the country of his origin, he takes particularly delight in the details of the discovery, exploration, and colonization of New Netherland. Now here's a facsimile part of the letter. And he continues, "A year later, a sumptuous quarto of 200 pages printed by the Marion Press of Frank Hopkins was published by Dodd, Mead and Company under the title Manhattan in 1628. The edition was limited to 175 copies on Holland handmade paper and 50 copies in Imperial Japan paper. The text includes a review of the letter in the original Dutch and the translation, and a historical sketch of the New Netherland from the year of discovery 1609 to the date of the letter 1628. Several of the 18 illustrations possess unusual interest, though through Nijhoff I learned that life-size separate portraits of Forrest and his wife, the latter is especially mentioned in the letter, were in the possession of the Forrest family living in Hilo, near the town of Alkmaar in North Holland. These portraits were painted in the same year as the letter was written. A photographer made the little journey. All journeys are pleasantly short in Holland. Negatives were taken and sent to me, from which colotypes were made. No portraits exist of Michaelmas, of Peter Mint, the director of New Netherland at the time, or of Jan Jansen Brewer, the worthy skipper who carried the letter to Holland, but negatives of the signature of Minuit and Brewer, also of the impression of the seal of the Dutch West India Company, about half the size of a dime, were sustained from documents owned by the state of New York. I very much desire to reproduce my photographic process, the interesting seal of New Netherland, with the funny little beavers surrounded by a string of wampum. This seal had been many times pictured, but always from drawings, none of which portray the actual appearance of the original. It was then first discovered that the original examples belonging to the state had been lifted from the old documents by a thief. While I was hoping I might learn of another original example, one of those surprises came that seemed almost too lucky to be true. A man brought to the rooms of the Holland Society an old Dutch document which he wished to have translated into English. The paper was nothing less than the original grant of land on Manhattan Island, dated January the 18th, 1651, signed in grand style by Director General Petrus Stuyvesant, and bearing an impression of the seal of New Netherland. The stranger proposed to return for the translation the following day, but Mr. Vesting, unwilling to assume the care of so valuable a document even overnight, set to work at once. An hour later the owner departed, taking the papers with him. The man had given his name and address, so the following day, after gently chiding the translator for not having sent word to me at the time of the fortuitous occurrence, I wrote asking permission to have a negative taken of the seal. This request was not granted. A few months later, my old friend, good Dame Fortune, came to the rescue. The owner placed the document with Dodd Mead and Company to be sold for his account, and though then, after a prolonged negotiation, I secured it. I need scarcely say that I had peculiar satisfaction in paying a very low price for this rarity. These delaying little difficulties being over, a fine calotype reproduction of the seal on the document was made, and is one of the notable illustrations of Manhattan in 1628. A picture of this very seal, as it appears on the historical document I own, is given in a book entitled The Civic Ancestry of New York City and State by Edward Seymour Wilde, a handsome volume published by the author in 1913. I first heard of and saw this book in the autumn of 1920. I could scarcely believe my eyes when I read this statement on page 33 opposite the picture. Oh, there's the seal. The statement is: a photograph of this seal was made in the State Library prior to March 29th, 1911, when the original was destroyed in the State House fire of that date, of which the foregoing is a reproduction. We must assume that the author, now deceased, was misinformed, for the fact is that the original document never belonged to the state of New York, and has been in my possession ever since I luckily acquired it in 1903. Apparently the picture of the seal in the Civic Ancestry of New York was made by photographic calotype in Manhattan in 1628. On the title page of Mr. Wilde's book is printed the old proverb, "Time brings the truth to light." The most important illustration in Manhattan in 1628 is the full-size calotype reproduction of the big letter itself. On the top of the first page is this greeting: "The peace of Christ. Honorable, very wise, very prudent, sir, kind friend." Having a good opportunity to write to others, I was not inclined to neglect doing the same to your honor. I had promised to write to your honor, and old as well as new obligations rendered me your honor's debtor in this regard. The letter is too long to be read here, but a few quotations will afford glimpses of the conditions on the island and the personality of the writer. Quote, "True, this island is the key and principal stronghold of the country. Food is scanty and poor. Fresh butter and milk are difficult to obtain, owing to the large number of people and the small number of cattle and farmers. Some directors and heads, by bad management, had rather kept back than helped the people and the country, and many among the common people would have liked to make a living and even to get rich by idleness rather than by hard work, saying they had not come to work, that so far as working is concerned they might as well have had stayed at home, and that it was all one whether they did much or little, if only in the service of the company." Such expressions were the burdens of the song one heard all day long. And many and may it please your honor, whose recommendations in behalf of deserving people carry great weight, to favor and gratify this person Yen Jensen Burrow whenever possible and proper, and behold in this a rare reward for your honor's kindness toward myself, of which I have been assured by numerous proofs extending over many years, that I do not hesitate to trouble you for favors to somebody else. It is too soon for me to know much about rare or beautiful objects here. However, I cannot neglect sending your honor some of the few I have, for this is the peculiar privilege of people of small means, that they are permitted to show through pleasant words or small trifles their gratitude for greater favors. End of quote. In his review of the letter, Mr. Verstang has this to say of the surname of the diplomatic dominie. Quote, in accordance with the custom of the age, he Latinized his name from the Dutch form of Michaelis to Michaelissen, or earlier Dutch ministers as a rule, the exception being Blom, Salens, and Schatz, adhered to the custom. The name of Michaelis' successor, Bogardus, was Latinized from Bogart, or Bogart, originally Van den Bogart, or Hewitt den Bogart. Polem or Poleme became Polemus. Backer was identified into Baccarus. Wheel or Wheel became Velius, and Dres or Dreisen turned to Dreisius. And the most striking change involved the calling in of the Greek language to construct the imposing name of Megalenius out of an original Van Meckelberg. Michaelis mentions 3 other letters written by him, 1 to his brother and 2 to Dominus Guhaus and Christiani in Holland. So far as we know, none of these or others that he doubtless wrote from the island during his protectorate has been preserved. The one to Forrest in my possession, and the one to Smoothius, now in the New York Public Library, are believed to be the only original letters now extant that were written by any one from the island of the Manhates during the early years of the settlement. Moreover, these 2 letters are not only the earliest letters they are, as well as the earliest existing documents of any sort that were written on the province of New Netherland. On a lucky morning in the autumn of 1902, while making a little journey from my hometown, Nutley, to New York City, I read in the newspaper the following letter of Frank B. Sanborn, a friend of Emerson, Alcott, Thoreau, and others of the Concord group, of which he was then the last living representative. To the editor of the New York Times, about 10 years ago in Genoa, searching among the bookstalls of a picturesque old city, then full of people at the Columbian Exposition, opened just 400 years after the discovery of America, I found an interesting memorial of Galileo. His little book of 1607, entitled Defense of Galileo Galilei, gentleman of Florence, lecturer on mathematics in the University of Padua, against the calumnies and imposture of Baldisseri Capra e Melicio, and his autograph at the foot of the title page in this form: all lit Scipio Saccharini il Astore, that is, to the illustrious Signor Capri Saccharini, the author. And here's the title page, a facsimile of the title page. On the same title page stood an inscription more than 200 years later, now in the property of Vincenzo Tirelli, bought in Florence in the year 1813, reigning then in Tuscany, Her Royal Highness Madame Elsa Sorelli, sister of Napoleon the Great, prefect of the department of the Arno, M. Foucault, and Bartolini, mayor of Florence. Accepting these inscriptions for what they profess to be, I did not look up the matter of who the recipient of the book might have been until last week, when I found an interesting story therein connected. Cipriano Saccarelli was an aged Florentine attached to the court of the great and Grand Duke of Ferdinand de' Medici, and had a nephew, Fernando, who seems to have been a pupil of Galileo at Padua or elsewhere. The letters addressed the letters addressed to Galileo, printed by the Italian government a few years ago, include 3 from the uncle and 2 from the nephew. The last, written in 1608, being from Fernando in reply to the letter of condolence from Galileo on the recent death of Signor Cipriano. The last letter of the uncles there printed is an acknowledgement of the very book which I have, thus fixing beyond doubt that it was a presentation copy. The important part of the letter, which is dated at Florence, September 11, 1607, is the letter of Your Excellency of the 24th ult, come to me by hand at Ludici, your kinsman, together with another of yours, for the serene prince. The aforesaid 2 letters came to me along with 2 little books which contain the defense of your excellency against the real plagiarist of your instrument, or geometer's compass. The copy for me I have read through, and hence it seems to me that if the audacious goat knew how to jump backwards, he would do so with all his might, I verily believe. Enough that your excellency has castigated him as he deserved, having with your pen lashed him, and, as we say in Florence, mounted him on the donkey. To the prince your letter was acceptable, the book pleased him, and I think he will presently read it. Your excellency knows that his highness loves and esteems you much. Galileo was at this time about 43 years old, and had made several of his noted discoveries, among them the satellites of Jupiter, which he named for the Medici family. He had long before invented the geometrical and military compass, and described in print its properties, and now this Milanese rogue comes forward to claim that as his own invention. Consequently, Galileo was forced to write the little book in question to prove his claim on the invention. Otherwise, it was no great merit, and as the edition was small, it must now be very rare volume. Perhaps my own copy be the only one in the country, and probably it is the only presentation copy. It is too peculiarly valuable for me to keep longer, and I am ready to dispose of it at the highest bidder. I have also a copy of the first 1605 edition of Sir Edwin Sandys's Relation to the State Religion in the Western Parts of the World, a valuable and well-printed book which has about 200 pages, and afterwards came out in several editions. This I will part with at the price of the last public sale. F.B. Sanborn, Concord, October 28th, 1902. On arrival at New York, I telegraphed that I would take both books. Of course, I followed the telegram with a letter. Mr. Sanborn's reply indicated deliberation, with willingness to give me first consideration in the disposal of the 2 priorities. Several letters were exchanged, but it was midwinter before the matter came to a head, and then I arranged to go to Concord. On arrival, I made my way through deep snow to the Sanborn homestead, where a careful welcome awaited me. Mr. Sanborn soon left the room, and in a moment returning bearing a very shabby volume. With a beaming smile, he exclaimed, "Here is the book you want," and part of the Relation of the State of Religion in my hands. As a reader may suspect, I was not particularly interested in the relation. In fact, I had no interest in it whatsoever, except that by offering to take both books I might be more likely to obtain the Galileo. I now made this quite clear to Mr. Sanborn, and stood by my original proposal. I would take the two books, but I should be quite content with only the Galileo. The defense was then brought, and Mr. Sanborn, taking the State of Religion from me, declared, "There is a lady here in Concord who would like the Galileo." I'll let her have this instead. As a result of inquiries, Mr. Sandberg had formed a definite view of the commercial value of the Defesia, which I willingly accepted. Notwithstanding the convincing circumstantial evidence afforded by the letter of the illustrious senior, I sent the volume to London for authoritative verification of the author's inscription. I quote the letter of Dr. Richard Garnett. I have compared the autograph of Galileo Galilei and the copy of Defesia de Galileo Galilei sent to you by Mr. W. H. Arnold with specimens of Galileo's handwriting in the British Museum. And I am satisfied of this genuineness. The officers of the manuscript department are of the same opinion. In arranging for the visit, I had been asked for lunch. At Mr. Sandburn's suggestion, a bottle of choice wine was brought. It had been in seclusion for 20 years, awaiting the suitable occasion. So there ends chapter 4. I am amazed at how he would send a book like that through the post back to England here to have it verified. And even in the introduction, he sent a Tennyson book to Thomas J. Wise through the post. That was very rare. Would anybody do that today? Except like that, you get on an airplane and take it there yourself. Because it's not worth the damage or the loss in the post, I would think. But anyway, that's chapter 4. I will see you next time, BookTube.